dear guests, dear our friends. I'm very honored and happy to see all of you today with us, especially after the long summer break. Geopolitical is a debate and discussion platform which we created together with the SWISS UMEF University of Applied Science Institute to raise important geopolitical topics and to understand better or deeper what is happening, what could be the consequences, and what scenarios could we propose our experts. So the topic of the discussion, as the leaders already said, it's USA, China, Russia, Triumvirate, or new war of civilization. It's never since the end of the Cold War, the world wasn't reshaped during these three rival poles, Washington, Beijing, and Moscow. But this triangle is not really balanced. It small looks like it's in a fire because the war in Ukraine is continuous. In Gaza, it's bloodshed continues. The situation around China becoming more tense. The same Arctic and Greenland becoming a new front of the war for resources. At the same time, tariffs, sanctions, deepen economic war. So we will talk today with our experts what is going on, if we are observing now a new world order, or we are on the eve of the Third World War. I am happy to present now our experts, Ambassador Branson McKinley, diplomat of the State Department, former American ambassador, former Director General of International Organization for Migration at United Nations. Zachary Palkin, he's a Deputy Director of the Better Order Project at the Queen's Institute for the Responsible Statecraft at Washington. And Hicheme Lehmici, a geopolitical analyst, is a professor adjunct in geopolitics and international relations at SWISS UMEF. He's regular columnist at Bastille magazine and other media. Hicheme Lehmici is the author of a geopolitical project launched in Annas, and together we created it in Geneva. My name is Katie Kujwari. I'm still diplomacy professional, former journalist, author of the book Building Peace, My Love is to be Found. We are here today not to criticize any government and their actions. We are here to understand what is happening in this world. So I would like to start with a question to Hicheme. So as we stated about the possible war of stabilizations, I would ask you, please, very briefly but deeply, explain us, make a characteristic of the three civilizations and what are the relations between them.
Très bien. Bonsoir Cathy, merci à tous. Bonsoir à tous. Bienvenue dans ce magnifique écrin qui est le campus de la SWISS UMEF. Alors, en quelques mots, lorsqu'on parle de guerre des civilisations ou de confrontation civilisationnelle, on renvoie en fait à un concept qui nous amène à Samuel Huntington, au milieu des années 90, 1996, avec son fameux ouvrage, Le clash des civilisations, le choc des civilisations, dans lequel justement était présenté dans le cadre post-guerre froide le fait que les conflits du moment ou les conflits d'avenir étaient des conflits qui ne seraient plus idéologiques, plus basés sur des éléments forcément économiques, politiques, mais plutôt sur des dissensions culturelles qui opposeraient des aires culturelles entre elles et qui s'expliqueraient un petit peu dans le cadre d'une mondialisation mal digérée par certaines nations ou certaines aires géographiques. Alors, c'est très intéressant sur le papier. Dans les faits, on peut dire que Samuel Huntington s'est cassé complètement la figure, car à part être repris régulièrement par le Premier ministre israélien Benjamin Netanyahou, c'est plus une thèse aujourd'hui qui est vraiment à la mode, même si durant les années 2000, dans la situation, le contexte post-attentat du 11 septembre 2001, c'est quelque chose qui a été fortement mis en avant. Et pourquoi je dis qu'en fait cette théorie n'a pas de validité? C'est tout simplement parce qu'elle est invalidée, vous me pardonnerez pour la répétition, par l'histoire, tout simplement parce que si on prend un cadrage historique, on regarde en fait tous les grands conflits dans toute l'histoire de l'humanité, ce sont des conflits qui ont eu lieu dans les mêmes aires géographiques, mêmes aires culturelles. Et si vous regardez l'actualité aujourd'hui, vous voyez que la fameuse ère culturelle orthodoxe qui rassemblait l'ensemble des orthodoxes de l'Eurasie sont aujourd'hui en conflit, dans un conflit absolument terrible qui a causé la mort de moins 1 million de personnes en Ukraine, entre la Russie et l'Ukraine. Si vous prenez ce qui se déroule au Moyen-Orient, on a des oppositions également qui mettent en fait en guerre des pays musulmans entre eux, avec un cas particulier sur lequel on reviendra sur la situation en Palestine. Si on regarde tous les conflits dits interethniques en Afrique, nous avons des conflits qui mettent surtout en opposition des voisins. Et puis si on revient à l'histoire, la guerre qui a été la plus terrible pour l'histoire de l'Europe, la guerre de 30 ans, entre 1619 et 1649, qui a vu la disparition de quasiment un tiers de la population européenne, c'était un conflit européen, certes basé peut-être sur des éléments culturels ramenés aux religieux, mais il y avait une dimension fondamentalement politique qui était liée à l'émergence d'un certain nombre de puissances montantes. Tout cela pour dire que ces théories, en réalité, ne sont pas véritablement valables et que si on devait interpréter une logique de guerre civilisationnelle, en fait, il faudrait peut-être la regarder autrement. Et moi, je m'intéresserais plutôt à l'historien français Fernand Braudel, qui, à travers son œuvre historique absolument exceptionnelle, et notamment son livre de référence, Grammaire des civilisations, mettait en avant le fait que, certes, on a des pôles civilisationnels réels qui s'inscrivent dans une certaine continuité historique et qui expliquent en grande partie leurs tropismes, leurs politiques étrangères, et on peut en dire quelques mots justement sur les États-Unis, la Russie, la Chine. Par exemple, dans le cas des États-Unis, une dimension qui est propre à la politique américaine, qui est cette idée, entre guillemets, d'exceptionnalisme américain, avec une dimension messianique qui s'explique assez facilement du fait que, dès l'origine, avec les pères fondateurs de ce qui deviendra plus tard les États-Unis, eh bien, nous avions une population de protestants puritains qui quittaient, entre guillemets, une Europe corrompue, qui ne le respectait pas dans leur diversité religieuse et qui voyait dans le Nouveau Monde, c'est-à-dire la Nouvelle-Amérique, eh bien, une terre de conquête et surtout une terre d'opportunités exceptionnelle, nonobstant le massacre des Indiens et l'esclavage des populations africaines, eh bien, a laissé cette idée que tout était possible et placer les États-Unis un petit peu dans une logique messianique et en même temps l'idée de destinée manifeste, que je n'oublie, et qui explique un petit peu cette volonté très américaine de vouloir un petit peu poser un modèle qui serait considéré comme le modèle du bien à l'extérieur, parfois avec de bonnes intentions et de réels résultats, avec la création de la SDN, même si les choses n'ont pas abouti par la suite et que les États-Unis n'y ont pas adhéré, et parfois pour le pire, si on se rappelle la séquence post-2000, à l'époque de George Bush fils, dans une logique destructrice du Moyen-Orient, où, à l'aune d'un certain discours messianique religieux, eh bien, les États-Unis avaient engagé une multiplication de guerres, et le Moyen-Orient ne s'en est toujours pas remis jusqu'à aujourd'hui. Si on prend le cas de la Russie, ce qui est intéressant, c'est de voir que derrière la Russie, il y a une espèce d'obsession maladive, qui est l'obsession des frontières. C'est-à-dire l'idée que la Russie, ayant été sous le joug de domination très longue, la domination mongole sur plusieurs siècles, les conquêtes napoléoniennes qui ont laissé un impact très fort dans l'inconscient collectif russe, ou l'invasion hitlérienne avec son lot de millions de morts pendant la Seconde Guerre mondiale, entre 20 et 25 millions de morts pour l'ex-Union soviétique, eh bien, il est resté chez les Russes cette idée qu'il fallait sécuriser les frontières à défaut d'avoir en fait des frontières naturelles réellement établies, et qui explique en quelque sorte tout l'intérêt que la politique étrangère russe, la politique sécuritaire russe, politique stratégique russe, donne à ce qu'on appelle l'étranger proche, avec cette idée qu'il faille toujours être en capacité de créer un espace satellitaire, une espèce de glacis de protection, et qui explique ce qui se passe en partie aujourd'hui en Ukraine. Et puis si on parle de la Chine, bien là il faut revenir à l'histoire impériale. La Chine, il faut savoir qu'elle existe depuis quasiment 2200 ans, donc depuis la dynastie Qin, si je ne me trompe pas, et que la Chine s'est toujours pensée en quelque sorte comme une espèce de centre du monde, et vit avec ce complexe de centralité, avec l'idée non pas que la Chine cherche à s'étendre, elle considère d'un point de vue civilisationnel, d'un point de vue culturel, qu'elle se suffit à elle-même, mais elle considère qu'elle doit être le centre en fait de l'attention. Elle fait venir le monde chez elle. Et ce qu'on est en train de voir aujourd'hui avec des projets tels que l'initiative des nouvelles routes de la soie, la BRI, Belt Road Initiative, ou bien la stratégie, vous savez ce qu'on appelle collier de perles, c'est ce que fait aujourd'hui la Chine en construisant un énorme réseau, le plus grand réseau du point de vue historique, ferroviaire, routier, qui vise à interconnecter les continents avec une centralité qui serait chinoise, on est dans ce qui est en fait l'ADN politique et l'ADN stratégique chinois. Donc voilà ce que j'aurais à dire, et je terminerai sur un mot, simplement pour rappeler un fait qui me paraît très important, c'est que si conflit civilisation, il devait exister dans cette espèce de triumvirat qui appelle à l'époque romaine. C'est au moment où vous aviez les trois grands généraux de l'époque qui s'étaient affrontés. Alors c'était Pompée, César et Crassus, dans ce qui allait devenir une guerre civile qui allait mettre fin à la République romaine. Alors j'aimerais que ce triumvirat ne se termine pas à l'échelle mondiale par une grande confrontation, une grande guerre mondiale, même si sur certains aspects on peut penser s'en rapprocher. Mais je pense que si on doit parler vraiment de fracture civilisationnelle, au sens civilisationnel du terme, je crois qu'il faut la regarder ailleurs. C'est plus la fracture qui existe en fait entre l'Ouest, l'Occident et le reste du monde, avec une Russie qui joue un petit peu un rôle d'entre-deux et qui explique pourquoi les États-Unis, à travers Trump, ont essayé de rapprocher en fait la Russie dans le camp occidental avec les résultats que l'on connaît, c'est-à-dire plutôt une aggravation de la situation en Ukraine et des tensions. Et là, ce qui est intéressant de voir, c'est que dans cette confrontation entre l'Ouest et le reste, ou l'Occident et le reste du monde, on est plus dans une opposition qui s'exprime à travers peut-être un déni occidental de la multipolarité qui vient, la multipolarité qui est, et peut-être un déni dans la compréhension des rapports de force mondiaux, que ce soit tant du plan économique, politique, stratégique. Et ce point-là, il me semble très, très important. Du coup, guerre ou non, on le verra. En tout cas, on se rapproche, pour ma part, de ce qui peut être une troisième guerre mondiale à venir, et qui est véritablement grave et dangereuse, mais peut-être pas dans le sens où on l'attendait.
Merci beaucoup, Hicheme. So if I correctly understood you, you're saying there is a West and the rest, now the opposition. My question to Ambassador McKinley, do you see things like this, or we are observing multipolarities? And if this multipolarity, is this a danger because this strength and fight, or it's a way maybe to build some peaceful coexistence? And how do you see it?
Thank you, Kati. Thanks to all of you for coming tonight. I do want to talk about multipolarity, and I'll use that term, as did Hicheme, rather than triumvirate, because I think it's more precise and something that most people now can agree about. I think everybody knows that for the time being, we are in a kind of multipolarity, as defined by three or more great powers whose relationship dominates the international relations scene in the world. And I'm going to argue that this is a fact, but also that it has the potential for being a factor of stability and peace. So I'm going to advocate for multipolarity. And in doing so, I want to point out to you a couple of things. First of all, multipolarity is not multilateralism. Some people kind of make that confusion. Those two things are actually opposite in some ways. Multipolarity is all about the sovereignty of great powers and how they exercise that sovereignty, whereas multilateralism is an attempt to create some restraints above the activities of the great powers. I also want to point out that there's a fair amount of confusion among observers, analysts, journalists especially, many of whom seem still to be locked in the bipolar world of the Cold War, or worse yet, in the unipolar world that followed the Cold War. And their analysis of what's happening in the world is, I think, skewed by their failure to realize that now we have three distinct poles which interreact with one another in important ways, both rivalry and cooperation. And I can understand why that is, because it's been a long time since the world saw a multipolar system. It was actually before the Second World War. Ever since, we've lived either unipolar or bipolar, but we've never had this kind of balance of power, three or more centers. And I think that's important to realize. I also want you to think about this in the Chinese fashion, if you will, long term. What I'm talking about is trends and tendencies that are driven by geography and history and demography, and will show their effect over many generations, and do not really have much application to the analysis of today's events or the latest, speech at the United Nations. This is a much longer view that I'm going to try to portray to you in my initial remarks, and then later on when I can spell it out in more detail. I want to point out that the three existing superpowers all have some pretty serious internal challenges. Now, you may think, as many do, that China has the momentum and everything's going China's way, and it's all playing into the hands of Chinese to become economically and politically and even militarily the superpower of the 21st century. I'm not so sure. I mean, the Chinese have made an interesting bet. They've kept a one-party autocratic regime while at the same time adapting capitalism and creating a large middle class. And there's a tension there. I'm not predicting that tension will necessarily be impossible to resolve, but I want you to think about the fact that that tension exists, and it's a problem for the leadership of China. Russia, same way. I mean, the fall of the Soviet Union was an enormous setback for Russia, from which it is still recovering. And the USA, too, in its way, although, by some measures is still doing pretty well, is clearly not what it used to be in terms of world dominance. And if you espouse "Make America Great Again," it's because you think it isn't so great after all. So all three countries have big internal problems. Having said that, you don't want to forget that the three powers just mentioned are also the ones with the big nuclear arsenals. US and Russia, approximate parity, around 6,000 warheads. China, fewer, but catching up fast, a significant number. And the other countries with nuclear weapons are far behind that. And nuclear, we know this from the Cold War, nuclear weapons are a force for stability. And I would argue here, again, that the foreign policy goals of each of the superpowers are in fact more similar than you might think. None of the three powers is overtly seeking world dominance. They want peace. They want to work things out. They want dominance in their own spheres of influence, that's for sure. The US will hold on to the Western Hemisphere as best it can. China will do its best to resume its traditional role of the dominant power in East Asia by pushing back, if necessary, the Americans who are at present surrounding them. So those peace and dominance in their own spheres of influence, an end to regional wars, dangerous regional wars. This is not sufficiently appreciated. The three superpowers are not pouring kerosene on fires around the world as they used to do from time to time during the Cold War. In fact, they would all like to see a situation in which those regional conflicts are diminished. And that applies especially, I think, to the Middle East. So if you look closely at what they're doing, I think you'll see, as I see, that US, China, and Russia, they all want the same kind of outcomes in the Middle East. So I argue that the fact of the existence of these of the three powers and the factors I've mentioned will oblige each one of them to take greater account of the interests and desires of the other two, so that you have a triangle, superpower at each point, but you have the three sides to the triangle, and on each side you're going to find a rather complicated mix of rivalry and opposition, but you're also going to see the desire to maximize mutually beneficial cooperation. So I think we're headed for, and we might be headed, it's hard to predict the future, but I wouldn't rule out the possibility that under the three powers, and maybe some more powers will come along. I think I'm going to talk about that in my next intervention, if I may. But under the three superpowers, there's a good chance of peace and stability through most of the 21st century, just as Westphalia led to European peace for most of the 17th century, and Vienna led to European peace for most of the 19th century. So I think it's not impossible. Here's a kind of a metaphor. If you make a stool, it has only one leg, it's going to topple. It's not going to be stable. If it has two legs, well, it'll be stable in one direction, but not in the other. Accidents are possible, indeed likely. If it has three legs, it will stand. And so that's my argument in a nutshell. 21st century could be a period of peace and stability because of multilateralism.
Thank you, Branston. I wish it would be like this, but the situation today doesn't look like this. As the forum gave us a hope that maybe the war in Ukraine could be stopped, that peace agreement could be reached. But yesterday, the new Trump statements that Ukraine can fight till they take back their territories and they will attack Russia. How to say, it looks like the war in Ukraine will continue. Do you see the end, and how do you see the end of the war in Ukraine? And what is the strategy of European Union by supporting Ukraine? Are they, trying to stop Russia not to progressing more, attacking them, and do you believe that Russia wants to attack the European countries? Or, we are, close to the Third World War?
Well, thanks very much, Kati, and merci beaucoup à vous tous. A pleasure to be here this evening. Before I get to those questions, and there's a lot to unpack there, I just want to provide maybe a little bit of a different perspective to the one provided by the ambassador just now on the question of multipolarity, and whether multipolarity is actually the best framework through which to understand current developments as the 21st century progresses. Because behind the idea of multipolarity are a few things. When we think of classical multipolarity in modern European history, we think first and foremost of the 19th century, and we think of the pentarchy in particular, which were five powers that were mostly evenly matched, right? So you had Britain, France, Germany, Russia, and then to a lesser extent, Austria-Hungary. We don't really have that today. Yes, there's more than just two poles per se, because we do have Russia. Russia is a great power, should be thought of as a great power. You've got rising powers like India. Europe is there to some extent, although the extent to which it will remain an independent power or become an independent power, the jury is very much out on it right now. But there's such a significant disparity of power between the top two right now, outside of the nuclear realm. You've got the United States and China, whose economies are far and ahead, the two largest in the world, far, far ahead of Russia and many other powers, India, etc. And that gap is likely to remain. So there's not a clear parallel there between 19th century multipolarity and what we have today. And another significant difference, of course, is that number one, global supply chains are far, far more integrated today, even than they were on the eve of World War I, which was at the high point of globalization historically up until that point. And another point that we should add as well is that the great powers today don't have the ability to set terms collectively the way that they did in the 19th century. In the 19th century, you didn't just have a balance of power between different great powers that were competing with one another. You had a collective balance of power that was jointly upheld. The Congress system, as it were, the concert of Europe. And you don't have anything like that today because you can't have anything like that today. Middle powers, smaller countries are more sovereign today in the sense that they are more capable of wielding power and surviving as states today to an extent far greater than was the case in the 19th century, where there's much less of a fear today that a certain country is simply going to be conquered and wiped off the map, as was the case in the 19th century. So the great powers, when they're not getting along today, it can cause a significant amount of disorder. But that doesn't mean that collectively they have the ability to set the terms of order the way that they did in the 19th century. So, as I mentioned, you've got the US and China that economically are far and ahead, greater than all the other powers. Does that mean that we're in a bipolar order? Does that mean that we should think of the emerging order as bipolar? I wouldn't necessarily say so either. First of all, the United States and China have fundamentally different goals. They have fundamentally different abilities to deploy power as well. The United States remains, in effect, the only country in the world with the ability to deploy all comprehensive facets of power at a global level, right? Military power, economic power, cultural power, diplomatic power. China still, although it is much more than a regional power at this point, it has not that same degree of reach, even though, of course, at the economic level, it's the number one trading partner to far more countries than is the United States at this point. Again, difficult at this point to think of, this is a bipolar system, and it's not clear to me that the United States and China are in some kind of a struggle for hegemony either, because many of China's goals are still very inwardly oriented and regionally oriented. And many people in the United States take for granted this idea that China seeks global dominance, global hegemony, and therefore there's this struggle, this competition between the United States and China that's inherent. But I don't see that necessarily today. We don't see this zero-sum ideological conflict that we saw of the Cold War either. So I don't think that bipolarity really fits. Now, does that mean that the world is unipolar? Well, it's certainly not unipolar in the way that the 1990s was unipolar, in which the United States could simply set the terms of international order and everyone else has to live with it. As we've seen full well, Russia and China and others have the ability to resist the American agenda, especially in their own regions. And so a unipolar order, it does not necessarily describe where we are either. We're past the unipolar moment of the 1990s and the early 2000s. So there's a lot of confusion actually as to how to describe this emerging international order, and I'm not sure that polarity necessarily fits. If you look at the framework of polarity in general, actually, when you've got an established power and rising powers that come to try to challenge it and to establish a new type of international order, it's not clear today that historical mold fits, right? In which you've got the status quo hegemonic power that's trying to defend its position, and then you've got rising powers that are trying to challenge it, as revisionist powers. That tended to be the model through most of the centuries of modern history, at least in Europe. But today that's not so clear. On the one hand, the United States is a status quo power. It wants to preserve its position as the dominant actor in the global system in different ways, obviously throughout history. The way Trump is doing that is very different to the way that more liberal-minded predecessors of his in the White House wanted to do this. But at the same time, you could characterize the post-Cold War Western-led liberal international order as a revisionist project, as a project that wanted to try to get the world to resemble the liberal West, the liberal capitalist West. Russia Is Russia a status quo power, or is it a revisionist power? It's a revisionist power in the sense that it seeks to overturn the compact, if you can call it that, of post-Cold War Europe, which it believes was forced upon it at a time of weakness in the 1990s. But you could also call it a status quo power because it's trying to preserve a sphere of influence that it doesn't want to lose. China is a rising power. It wants to change certain aspects of the international order to be perhaps a little bit less liberal, a little bit less focused on discourses of human rights as understood in the West. So perhaps it's a revisionist power in that sense. But of course it wants to preserve the internationally globalized order from which it has benefited so much, and that has allowed it to grow its economy and lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. And so my contention, and I'm hoping to get into this a little bit in my forthcoming book, is that the best way to conceive of this emerging international order is as the first truly global order in history. Because what we saw throughout the most recent couple of centuries of modernity actually was not a fully global order of sovereign equals. You had, in the 19th century, an imperial core and a colonial periphery, in which Europe was actually the term setter, so it may have been global in scope, but it wasn't truly global in the sense of every actor being a set of sovereign equals. During the Cold War, you had basically two distinct orders rather than one global order. And then in the post-Cold War era, you had this attempt by the liberal West to, as I've said, transform the liberal international order from being just one of the blocks of the Cold War into being synonymous with global order itself, but that project has failed. And so why there's all this lack of clarity about does polarity fit, who's a status quo power, who's a revisionist power, all of that is because we're actually entering an unprecedented period in history. We're entering what should be thought of, I contend, as the first truly global order in history. And what it's going to look like is something that's being litigated right now. And whether the different powers with different visions about what that international order should look like are actually going to be able to live together in a common order with a set of common norms, with a set of common institutions, actually remains to be determined. We don't know the answer to that question yet. And so whether this emerging balance of power in the world is going to be a force for stability or for instability, I think remains to be seen. A lens that is realist, that focuses on polarity, assumes that we are dealing with more multipolarity equals more stability, right? You saw the liberal West try to maximize its power too much after the Cold War, and as a result, Russia has aligned with China, and that is a stabilizing act in the international order. That's how a realist with a polarity lens would conceive of the international order. But the international order is not more stable now than it was 5 years ago or 10 years ago. We're dealing with mounting conflict, rival normative visions about what the international order should look like. And so I'd be very cautious about this idea that the balance of power itself can tell you about whether we have a stable international order. The balance of power is an idea that relies upon anarchy sort of governing itself through however power is arrayed over time. But anarchy doesn't tell you how the world is ordered. Anarchy tells you that the world is not ordered. So if you're interested in the question of international order, we need to go into the realm of norms and ideas and what sort of visions different powers have. As Alex Wendt famously said, anarchy is what states make of it, ultimately. To dwell, I don't know if I've still got a few more minutes just to dwell on the questions that you raised. Just to talk about Donald Trump's recent comments, which took many of us by surprise, but if you actually look at the precise content of what he said, and again, it's hard to know for sure because this is a very mercurial personality, but my sense is that he doesn't want to own this conflict in Ukraine. It's Biden's war. He said this very consistently for quite some time, and what he's doing with these statements is basically saying, this is Europe's problem. He said Ukraine can win back its territory with European support. And if Europe wants to keep buying weapons from the United States and doing whatever it wants with them, that's fine with us, but we're not going to take a lead in doing that. So ultimately what he's trying to do here is to say this is Europe's responsibility. I'm washing my hands of this. Maybe there will come a time in the coming weeks or months in which the different parties to the conflict will realize that they need the United States to come back in as an active mediator. But right now the different parties are just so far apart that they're not quite prepared for that right now. Again, this idea that Trump has fundamentally changed tack now, that he's fundamentally backing Ukraine's cause, I don't see that, in part because we haven't seen Trump impose massive sanctions on Russia. They've increased tariffs on India, but are very cautious about doing that on China, given how the U.S.-China trade spat played out earlier in Trump's presidency, in which China demonstrated that it does very much have sources of leverage over the United States. What Trump did by saying we want Europe to impose 50 to 100% tariffs on China and India for buying Russian energy, and if you do it, we'll do it. He said that because he knows Europe's not going to do it. He's not going to have to do it. That seems clear to me that he doesn't have the political wherewithal to see something like that through. Right now we're in a waiting game, is what I would say, and not all that much has changed. On the question of the end game, whether or not this can be called a frozen conflict, I think you wanted me to dwell on that to some extent. The front line is not frozen right now, so we're nowhere near a frozen conflict. As we saw in World War I, things look like they're at a stalemate until very quickly they're not, and that is entirely possible that could happen this time. And a frozen conflict as a negotiated outcome is also not a possibility, because Russia's made it very clear it's not interested in just an unconditional ceasefire. What they want is a negotiated political comprehensive settlement to the conflict. And not only is a frozen conflict not possible, it's not even desirable, because it would be highly unstable. It would threaten a future war that could suck the United States back into Europe's problems at a time when the United States wants Europe to stand on its own 2 feet more, so that the United States can array its assets differently. And of course, if you have an unstable ceasefire situation, it makes it very difficult to get the private sector investment you need to rebuild Ukraine and to prepare Ukraine to meet the conditions necessary for EU accession, which is, of course, something that you want to see as part of any negotiated settlement as well, because in any negotiated settlement, all parties would want to be able to save face. And one thing that Ukraine would be able to claim from agreeing to the settlement is the prospects of peace, and joining the West, joining the EU, are far greater than the prospects of continued war. But what are the EU's goals then, if a frozen conflict is not really possible here? What really concerns me is something that you hear in many mainstream European corners these days, is this idea that the Europeans believe that a bad deal to end the war is actually worse than continued war. And I hear that a lot, and maybe some of you in the audience hear that as well. First of all, it's very painful to hear an organization, the European Union, that's supposed to be a peace project, say something like that the continuation of war is preferable to diplomacy and peace. But the fear in so many European capitals is that a deal with Russia that offers Russia, by definition, it will have to offer Russia sanctions relief, otherwise Russia's not signing up, and that offers Russia, in relative terms, more influence over Ukraine, that this will basically allow Russia to rearm, to reintegrate itself into the global economy, to get the technological assets it needs in order to rebuild its military, and ultimately to pose a bigger threat militarily and geographically to Europe. And so from Europe's perspective, a war in Ukraine continuing keeps Russia tied down, at least for now. The problem is that, of course, this is entirely self-defeating for so many reasons. Russia has found ways to avoid sanctions and to get the technological components it needs to wage war. It is already remilitarizing. Its military is larger now and has far more troops in Ukraine now than it originally invaded Ukraine with. The country is going to become more nationalistic the longer the war goes on, and its dependence on China is going to increase the longer the war goes on. And that's not in our interest either. That means that we have less influence over Russia and actually being able to influence Russian policymaking. Now, we made a huge mistake after the Cold War in thinking that our ability to influence Russia means we can tell them what to do and they're going to do it. They're a great power, as I've said, and you're never going to be able to tell a great power entirely what its interests are. But the question is relative influence. Are you going to have relative influence? And we are going to lose that relative influence the longer the war goes on. And we think that by maintaining this war, we're attriting Russian forces and we're tying them down. But they've made it clear they are prepared, to achieve, their core political aims here, if necessary, and to weather the economic costs of it, to weather the human costs of it. At this point, after so many sunk costs, they're going to need something that resembles, a victory that they can sell at home, and that's going to require us to be willing to negotiate. Otherwise, if we keep this up, we risk having a self-fulfilling prophecy in which the next war with Russia actually becomes more likely, and of course more devastating than the current war, rather than less likely. And let me just say one last thing on this, which a colleague of mine pointed out to me recently, which of course we don't point this out often enough, is that a lot of folks in Europe say, excuse me, that we can't make a deal with Russia that restores certain economic or energy links between Europe and Russia by the lifting of sanctions, etc. Because if we do that, then Russia is going to, get influence over us again, and we're going to become dependent on Russian energy like we were on the eve of the war, and Russia is going to be able to blackmail us, and we won't be able to defend our interests. Well, wait a second. Russia has been selling more energy to China since the start of the war. Do we say that that means that Russia now has the ability to blackmail China? No, we never say that. We say that Russia is becoming more dependent on China. So the discourse about Russia-China relations that we have in the West is entirely different from the discourse that we have in Europe. So look, again, it's about relative influence. If you can have some economic links with Russia, that's beneficial. Of course, there should not be the level of energy dependence on Russia that Europe had on the eve of the war, but some degree of Europe's energy portfolio coming from Russia can be a source of European strategic autonomy if it has a diversified portfolio overall, including some from the United States, some from Russia, some from elsewhere, and that seems like a reasonable approach to statecraft. Unfortunately, we don't seem to see that these days in Brussels and in many European capitals, who have really just been entirely devoured by this self-destructive discourse, vis-a-vis Russia, that actually, over the long run, is going to undermine European security, and that I think should concern all of us.
Thank you very much, Zach, but I have additional question, because for me it's not really clear how this war in Ukraine could be finished. As you said, Russia is militarizing, but Europe also actively militarizing. And as we can see, Trump now leading the negotiations, and from Russia's side or Ukraine's side, how to say, it's really a lot of doubt if they will continue constructive negotiations. So where we are going to a third world war with all this militarization, or there is a hope that this war in Ukraine will finish?
I think everybody knows what the potential endgame from the standpoint of a comprehensive settlement in Ukraine could look like. What a compromise that is fair on the basis of where the situation on the battlefield currently stands. I think everyone more or less knows what that's going to look like. It's going to involve Ukraine not being admitted to NATO and some kind of declaration that Ukraine will not join NATO. Whether it'll be a political declaration, something more legally binding, we don't know, but at the very least, that's a red line for Russia. It's also going to have to involve no foreign troops, Western troops on Ukrainian soil. Russia has also said that's a red line. Maybe we can make some kind of an exception that could be strictly negotiated between Russia and the West in terms of a training force, or military engineers, etc., on Ukrainian soil, for deterrence effect as tripwire. But other than that, there will have to be no combat forces of the West on Ukrainian soil. In exchange for that, Russia is going to formally, in a document, endorse Ukraine's future in the European Union. And Putin has already come out and explicitly said, actually, overruling more hardliners within Moscow, saying that that's something that he would support. And then on top of that, there's going to have to be other issues dealt with in terms of reparations and reconstruction in Ukraine, and whether some of that is going to come from Russia's frozen assets, and whether some of this is going to be tied as well to questions of arms control limitations, both along the ceasefire line in Ukraine, but also in the broader European theater. So all of this is sort of well known. The broad parameters of a compromise could theoretically look like is well known. There's also the question, of course, of Russian linguistic minorities in Ukraine, the Russian Orthodox Church, etc. This is stuff, again, that's eminently negotiable. I think the hardest sticking point right now, the biggest sticking point, is Putin's demand that Ukraine needs to vacate the rest of Donetsk. That's just not something that any Ukrainian president can agree to and survive, not only for political reasons, but also because for the past decade now, this part of the country has been very heavily fortified. It would leave Ukraine extremely vulnerable to a future Russian attack if it were to withdraw. And so in exchange for Russia dropping that demand, perhaps the so-called coalition of the willing can drop their demand to place combat forces on Ukrainian soil, and that could be deemed sort of a fair compromise. And then, of course, we have to sort out the size of the Ukrainian military and what sorts of weapons they would be allowed to receive. It needs to be large enough to defend Ukraine. So this idea of Ukraine's demilitarization that Putin has put forward since the beginning of the war, that will have to be something that will have to be dropped or considerably revised. But there will still have to be some kind of restrictions, of course, on long-range missiles that could pose a threat to Russia's security, and Russia could perhaps engage in some reciprocal measures near the Ukrainian border as well, so that there are effective security measures and guarantees for both countries. So that's the package. That's theoretically what it could look like. Are we going to get there? I don't know. The question is how you get from here to there. There needs to be political will on all sides, and the different parties need to understand that their positions can be reconciled, and the only way to do that is if the United States takes an active role in this process. The United States needs to say, very clearly to the Russians, we can give you something that others cannot give you. We can give you a more favorable security environment in Europe in exchange for you dropping some of your unrealistic demands vis-a-vis Ukraine. The Europeans can't do that because of the zeitgeist that's plaguing Europe right now and this drive towards rearmament, etc. I'm quite alarmed that if the United States is not actively involved, that the Ukrainians, backed by the Europeans, are going to have every incentive to further escalate this conflict, in a fashion that could prove extremely dangerous, and they have the capacity to increasingly to do that now, as we've seen, to strike deep beyond the front line. In sum, we know what the broad parameters of a comprehensive settlement will look like. The question is, can we convince everybody that it's in their interest to do that, and basically outline a vision in which everyone sees that a deal is actually better to continued war. And right now we're not there. What concerns me as well is that there may be some folks in Moscow, and I don't know if they're in the ascendant right now, but there may be some who think that they can achieve all of their aims on the battlefield. Not just military aims, but political aims as well. And I don't think that that's the case. I think that if Ukraine's front line collapses, you see a significant defeat of Ukraine on the battlefield, this is going to raise alarm bells all across Europe, and this is going to make it much, much more difficult, not just for Europe, but for the broader West as well, including the United States, to pursue the kind of reset, even a partial reset with Russia that the United States needs in order to conduct a grand strategy that is apt for a post-unipolar world in which it is not overwhelmingly focused exclusively on this, or almost exclusively on the European theater. So that's something that I think we should be concerned about as well.
Thank you very much, Zach. We're still in Europe. My question will be to Hicheme. We saw recently provocations with drones in Poland, in Romania, some drones in Denmark. Don't you think in Moldova there is now a very decisive elections, and this country is now in a very risky zone? Don't you think that, the war in Ukraine can expand to other countries like Poland and Moldova? So what do you see how do you see the European Union itself? Can they rely to the Americans now, seeing all these situations with Trump attitude? So, what is your forecast?
Très bien. Merci, je vais essayer d'être un peu plus long. J'allais demander à Zach de nous faire un petit résumé en français. Du coup, je ne savais pas si c'était une bonne idée ou pas, mais tu peux le faire, parce que je pense que certains... Mais vraiment, quelques lignes. On peut en parler après.
Ça fait déjà 1 heure qu'on parle.
Alors, pour répondre à la question, savoir s'il y a un risque, selon moi, d'extension du conflit en dehors de l'Ukraine. Alors, j'aurais peut-être un point de vue un petit peu décalé en considérant que d'un certain point de vue, lorsqu'on parle de risque de Troisième Guerre mondiale, on peut quasiment dire que cette Troisième Guerre mondiale a commencé en tant que telle. Elle a commencé en tant que telle, je l'ai déjà dit, ça fait quasiment plus d'1 an. Ça a été repris dernièrement par M. Jacques Attali, qui généralement est assez bien informé des ressorts profonds dans les logiques conflictuelles qui traversent les différents leaderships politiques. Et lorsqu'on parle de Troisième Guerre mondiale, il ne faut pas simplement l'imaginer à la façon dont les autres grands conflits mondiaux en fait se sont constitués, c'est-à-dire simplement logique militaire. Mais si on analyse du point de vue d'analyse purement culturelle, on est véritablement en guerre en Europe, dans une guerre qui oppose à plusieurs échelles la Russie et l'Ukraine, la Russie, l'Europe et l'Occident plus globalement, et plus spécifiquement, on peut dire l'Occident face au reste du monde. Et ça, c'est une réalité que beaucoup parmi les élites européennes refusent de voir. Alors parler d'un danger, d'un risque d'extension, j'ai envie de dire oui. On est déjà dans une extension qui n'est pas dite. Est-ce que vous savez, enfin la plupart vous le savez, qu'on a déjà des troupes américaines en Ukraine qui combattent, entre guillemets, sous faux drapeaux ou faux uniformes. Les F-16 qui ont été livrés ne sont pas pilotés par des Ukrainiens, sont pilotés par des pilotes américains. Les canons César qui sont utilisés par l'armée ukrainienne sont monitorés par des spécialistes, des techniciens français. Ça, c'est une réalité. Moi, j'ai vu des images où on avait des Français qui opéraient sur les canons César et qui étaient facilement reconnaissables à la langue, à l'allure, et parce que de toute façon, ces éléments techniques ne peuvent pas être utilisés à moins d'une formation technique particulièrement rodée que les Ukrainiens, avec toutes les qualités et compétences militaires qui sont les leurs, ne peuvent pas improviser en tant que tels. Et ça, c'est une donnée qui est importante à mettre en avant. On a déjà une confrontation directe, en fait, entre troupes occidentales et troupes russes. Et si on va encore un peu plus loin, en faisant allusion justement aux derniers incidents qui sont assez étranges, parce qu'il n'y a pas d'intérêt stratégique russe à vouloir, entre guillemets, empiéter les frontières aériennes de la Pologne, des pays baltes, du Danemark. On est plus dans la guerre psychologique. Peut-être des tentatives de test pour voir un petit peu comment les pays de l'OTAN réagissent. Est-ce que c'est du false flag, c'est-à-dire des opérations sous faux drapeau pour faire monter la tension et peut-être faire justifier un certain nombre de décisions stratégiques qui seraient prises pour pouvoir répondre à la Russie et ouvrir le champ à une confrontation directe qui aujourd'hui n'est pas acceptée par les populations. Et moi, le risque que je vois, c'est pas tellement la Pologne, parce qu'on a cité la Pologne avec les derniers incidents, même si il est vrai que le nouveau leadership polonais, que ce soit Donald Tusk ou le nouveau président, sont assez, comment dirais-je, engagés dans une logique militariste à l'égard de la Russie, ce qui était très différent de l'ancien leadership. Si vous prenez le président Duda, qui était totalement opposé au prix d'une opposition directe avec la Russie. La population polonaise, dans sa grande majorité, est totalement opposée à l'idée d'une confrontation avec la Russie, tout en étant profondément russophobes. Ils ne sont pas à une contradiction près. À mon avis, le risque de tension, c'est plus la Moldavie, la Roumanie, voire peut-être les pays baltes. Et il va falloir surveiller en fait ce qui va se dérouler dans les semaines qui viennent. En tout cas, ce qui est certain, c'est que du point de vue culturel, du point de vue politique, du point de vue idéologique, du point de vue médiatique, du point de vue économique, nous sommes dans des logiques de guerre. Et dans des logiques de guerre dans laquelle, pour parler de l'Europe est très mal préparée. Que ce soit en termes de production industrielle militaire, l'Europe est très loin du niveau de production industrielle de la Russie aujourd'hui, ou du point de vue technologique. En fait, l'Europe, elle a une guerre de retard. C'est-à-dire qu'on peut se gargariser, mettre en avant des systèmes d'armes modernes qui sont en réalité très peu adaptés au champ de bataille. Aujourd'hui, lorsqu'on observe ce qui se déroule en Ukraine, les game changers sont venus de pays du Moyen-Orient. Ce sont des technologies turques et iraniennes, c'est-à-dire au niveau de la dronisation du champ de bataille. Et ça, c'est une nouveauté qu'on n'a pas pris suffisamment en compte. Et si on regarde, par exemple, et je fais une analogie qui n'est pas liée directement à l'Europe, plus à l'Asie, le dernier sommet de l'OCS, et qui l'a accompagné, c'est le grand défilé militaire qui a eu lieu en Chine. C'était quelque chose qui était impressionnant, non pas tellement par son ampleur, n'importe qui parmi les grandes puissances peut organiser un défilé militaire impressionnant, mais c'était les nouveaux systèmes d'armes qui est totalement inconnu même par des spécialistes occidentaux, qui ne sont pas dans une logique de veille très active, qui considèrent la Chine comme un pays qui essaye de rattraper un retard technologique, alors qu'en réalité la Chine, que ce soit en matière de technologie militaire ou en matière de guerre électronique, mais ils ont une génération d'avance en réalité sur l'Europe et les États-Unis. On a vu des systèmes d'armes qui étaient totalement inconnus, des systèmes par exemple de sous-marins qui étaient en capacité d'opérer sur les champs air-mer avec une capacité furtive. Donc pendant que les Européens faisaient la guerre et s'entretuaient, et ce qui est intéressant, vous savez, avec toutes les logiques, toutes les idéologies d'extrême droite autour de l'idée du grand remplacement, on voit que les Européens se grand remplacent très vite, avec 1 million de morts en Ukraine. Donc je fais une petite pique politique simplement pour pousser à réfléchir. La situation est particulièrement grave et particulièrement dangereuse. Lorsqu'on analyse les guerres, lorsque par exemple on s'intéresse à la Première Guerre mondiale, on reprend des historiens comme un historien français Becker qui s'intéressait justement à la production culturelle avant l'éclosion de cette guerre, il est à regarder qu'il y a des similitudes incroyables, c'est-à-dire, entre guillemets, la déshumanisation de l'autre, la présentation de tout ce qui peut relever de l'information dans des logiques manichéennes, absolues, indépassables, le fait qu'on fasse taire politiquement ceux qui portent une voix, qui soit simplement une voix de paix. On est accusé, vous êtes pro-russe, vous êtes pro-chinois, vous êtes pro-ceci, vous êtes pro-palestinien, lorsque vous opposez simplement à un génocide. Ça, pour moi, c'est beaucoup plus inquiétant que tout le reste. C'est-à-dire que nous sommes lancés dans une logique militariste qui risque de ne pas se terminer, surtout que l'on est confronté en Europe à des crises politiques particulièrement graves, avec des leaderships politiques qui ne sont pas capables d'apporter des réponses, notamment dans des pays comme la France, comme l'Allemagne, ou en lien avec ce qui se déroule en Ukraine, c'est-à-dire toutes les logiques de sanctions qui ont été prises à l'égard de la Russie, en fait, on a affaire aujourd'hui des économies qui sont en ruine, des industries qui sont dans une situation de collapse, avec des délocalisations très importantes de l'Europe vers les États-Unis qui sont l'un des grands vainqueurs en réalité de la guerre en Ukraine, du point de vue économique, du point de vue technologique également. Et pour la question de savoir, dans le cadre de la relation qui existait entre les États-Unis et l'Europe, si quelque part l'Europe avait une part d'indépendance ou d'autonomie souveraine, on peut constater qu'en réalité l'Europe est dans un processus de vassalisation avancé et qu'il faut peut-être comprendre l'évolution des choses dans la logique de reconfiguration des grands blocs stratégiques, grands blocs géopolitiques de la planète. Aujourd'hui est peut-être en train de se constituer un espèce de grand bloc occidental où l'Europe n'est qu'un élément périphérique en fait des États-Unis dans une logique de confrontation qui permet en fait aux États-Unis d'affirmer cette domination, et l'Europe est spectatrice avec des élites qui n'ont pas l'air de prendre en considération la gravité de ce qui est en train de se dérouler. Moi, je vous inviterais juste à faire une chose. Moi, je suis, entre guillemets, j'essaie de faire une veille sur tous les grands débats stratégiques, politiques, qu'on retrouve à la fois aux États-Unis, en Russie, en Inde, en Chine. Moi, ce que je constate, c'est que sur la question de la guerre, en Russie, on parle de Troisième Guerre mondiale depuis au moins 2014-2015 dans tous les programmes télévisés, grands médias, et c'est une discussion qui est tout à fait, comment dirais-je, commune dans les débats politiques et dans les échanges en Russie. Ça veut dire que la Russie est préparée déjà, non pas qu'elle veuille cette guerre continentale, mais elle est préparée mentalement, elle est préparée du point de vue industriel, elle est préparée économiquement. On voit comment les sanctions, au lieu de faire ruiner l'économie russe, ça produit l'effet inverse. C'est-à-dire que la Russie s'est constituée dans une logique d'industrie de guerre relative, avec une économie qui marche très bien, pendant que l'Europe est en train de s'enfoncer économiquement. Et ce que l'on voit de l'autre côté, c'est là où le monde occidental avait une logique, entre guillemets, d'exclusivité dominante, notamment sur les technologies d'armes les plus avancées. Ce n'est plus le cas. On a vu comment en Ukraine, les drones iraniens ont déstabilisé pendant longtemps l'armée ukrainienne. On a vu comment des drones turcs ont posé des problèmes sérieux à l'armée russe. Le monde est en train de changer. Et si on parle des technologies chinoises, on se situe encore à un autre niveau. Et on l'a vu dans la confrontation entre le Pakistan et l'Inde, où ça a été un choc technologique, notamment pour les spécialistes français. On a vu comment les Rafales se sont fait abattre avec une facilité déconcertante avec les systèmes d'armes qu'utilisaient les Pakistanais, notamment leurs avions de combat et leurs systèmes de missiles qui avaient une portée quasiment 2 fois supérieure aux portées des missiles les plus performants dont disposent les armées occidentales. Et ça, c'est quelque chose qu'on ne regarde pas assez.
One additional question about the war in Ukraine, which is ongoing, about the Middle East, Gaza, Israel, and the whole Middle East is very hot. And the situation in Asia around China. Do you see any connection between these wars and if it's the same, how to say, big war?
Alors j'ai toutes les questions difficiles, j'ai toutes les questions de la fin du monde. Alors évidemment qu'il y a une connexion. Alors ce ne sont pas des crises qui sont forcément directement liées, mais en tout cas, elles ont un point commun, c'est qu'elles s'insèrent aujourd'hui dans des logiques de contestation, qui sont les logiques de contestation, en fait, de l'ordre occidental dominant, si je peux le dire de cette façon. Si vous prenez la guerre en Ukraine, certes, vous allez me dire, alors la Russie, ce n'est pas les pays du Sud, d'accord, mais la Russie n'est pas considérée non plus comme l'Occident. Et d'un point de vue, l'éclatement de cette guerre en Ukraine, elle vient de la tentative, entre guillemets, des pays occidentaux de vouloir imposer une dominance, notamment en Europe centrale et aux marges de ce qui est la Russie, que la Russie a contesté, parce que la Russie d'aujourd'hui n'est plus la Russie de la fin de la guerre froide, qui était en état de délabrement, de guerre civile. Et donc là, on a un élément où on est dans cette logique en fait d'opposition Occident-reste du monde. Si on prend Taïwan, alors vous allez me dire que c'est une crise qui est ancienne, qui est liée au fait que la Chine considère Taïwan comme tout simplement la Chine, un territoire chinois, et que de toute façon, un jour ou l'autre, Taïwan rejoindra la Chine. C'est un fait historique, tout le monde le sait. On essaye juste ou de gagner du temps, ou simplement de poser des problèmes à la Chine, mais la réalité géopolitique, la réalité économique, politique, elle est là. Aujourd'hui, 70% du commerce extérieur de Taïwan, c'est avec la Chine. Il suffira juste de demander aux milliardaires taïwanais vous voulez être chinois ou pas, sinon on arrête les affaires. À mon avis, généralement, l'argent suit l'argument de l'argent. Et on n'aura pas beaucoup à faire de l'argument politique de dire que nous sommes une formidable démocratie, etc. D'autant plus que du côté chinois, on va mettre en évidence la grande théorie d'une Chine, deux systèmes. Bon, on rajoutera un troisième système, une Chine, trois systèmes, et le tour est joué. Mais dans cette guerre, on a affaire de la même façon à une opposition entre Occident et reste du monde, avec une Chine qui conteste l'unipolarité. Et pour aller dans le sens de ce qui a été dit tout à l'heure par Zachary, de façon très, très brillante, hein, vraiment avec une connaissance théorique assez impressionnante, eh bien, si on prend le dernier sommet de l'OCS, qu'est-ce qui s'est déroulé? Qu'est-ce qui a été dit par le dirigeant chinois Xi Jinping? Il a expressément exprimé, dit que le monde de l'unipolarité, le système unipolaire était terminé et qu'aujourd'hui la voie était la voie de la multipolarité. Bon, il n'a pas dit la suite, qui était de dire que c'était une multipolarité dont la centralité, bien évidemment, était située en Chine, mais la Chine s'inscrit dans une logique, en fait, ou une espèce de théorie qui est liée beaucoup à cette vision très ancienne, qui est l'idée d'assurer une espèce d'harmonie terrestre, entre guillemets, entre les différentes composantes qui font le jeu des puissances. Et pour revenir à la question du Moyen-Orient, qui est également un dossier particulièrement chaud et grave, avec un risque de guerre régionale très sérieux, puisqu'aujourd'hui, on sait que l'Égypte se prépare à la guerre face à Israël, et que ce ne sont pas que des mots. J'ai été longtemps correspondant en Égypte et j'ai pas mal de relais là-bas, notamment à travers des militaires qui ne sont plus forcément en poste, mais qui disent que c'est vraiment sérieux, que c'est pas de la blague. Vous avez eu le conflit entre Israël et l'Iran pendant 12 jours, où sans l'intervention américaine, les choses se seraient très très mal passées. Et on a un risque de nouveaux jeux, en fait, peut-être dans quelques mois, de guerre qui impliquerait un certain nombre d'États et dont on saura peut-être le début, mais on ne saura jamais la suite. Parce que c'est comme un espèce de jeu de domino. Vous savez comment ça se commence, vous ne savez pas forcément quand ça se termine. Et en la matière, je pense que la situation, elle est assez inquiétante. Et ce qui relie, en dehors de ce jeu, en fait, entre ce qui est le monde occidental et le reste du monde, ce que l'on voit aujourd'hui à Gaza. Qu'est-ce qui est en train de se passer à Gaza? À Gaza, on est en train d'assister à la destruction définitive et absolue de tout le récit occidental, le récit des valeurs, le récit des droits. Pourquoi? Parce qu'on est en train de génocider une population en direct, dans une logique de solidarité, avec un État dont on considère quelque part qu'il est une enclave occidentale, au Moyen-Orient, et dont on accepte tout, en fait, parce que justement il est occidental. Et ça, c'est quelque chose qui est scandaleux, qui va à l'encontre de toutes les valeurs universelles, de toutes les valeurs humanistes qui pourraient exister. Et pour conclure, il y a un autre élément qui, entre guillemets, rassemble toutes ces crises, c'est que quelque part, nous sommes rentrés dans une espèce de logique absolue. On se rappelle toujours des mots de Clausewitz, qui disait, entre guillemets, la guerre, c'est la continuation de la politique par d'autres moyens. En réalité, aujourd'hui, nous sommes dans une logique de culture de guerre totale, expansif qui touche à tous les domaines et où tous ces éléments, le politique, l'économique, le culturel, sont en fait les continuations de la guerre par d'autres moyens. Et c'est ça qui est inquiétant, parce que les processus de désescalade sont tous en train de disparaître les uns après les autres. Et ça n'augure rien de bon.
Merci beaucoup. Branson, I think you're the only one who is the most optimistic here. Please, can you share your vision? What should happen that three poles, Washington, Beijing, and Moscow, will find peaceful coexistence, so the new Yalta will happen?
Yes, Katie. Of course, I'll be happy to comment on this. I do think Hicheme's vision of the world is a bit alarmist, to be quite honest. I don't see that the big powers have any interest in going to war one with another. There's plenty of room for dirty tricks back and forth. There's plenty of room for propaganda and cultural conflicts, but to risk what each of those three countries is trying to build by going to a war which could turn nuclear, I think you can be very, very, very sure that Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, and Donald Trump have no interest whatsoever in that, none whatsoever. And there are a few little hiccups on the way to the peaceful multipolar world. Ukraine is one and Gaza is another, but these are in the big picture and in the long term relatively minor, and they will sort themselves out. In fact, they are sorting themselves out. And 3 or 4 years from now, they will be sorted out. I wanted to say a few things about the relationship of the three superpowers, each with the other two, and the possibility of other superpowers coming to join their ranks. Frankly, I don't think that's likely to happen. People talk about India, but if you think about the India-Pakistani relationship and the necessity of large-scale nuclear rearmament on the part of India, if it wishes to be a superpower, which would provoke a hugely dangerous Pakistani reaction, I think you will agree with me that the three big powers have no interest at all in seeing India go in that direction. Some people talk about the European Union converting itself into a superpower. I think that's a fantasy. I don't think there's any chance at all of any group of European powers becoming a superpower, because Europe, starting in 1945, took a different path. It took the path of social democracy. It took the path of large public administration and complete welfare state. Very expensive, but very addictive. And the populations of Europe are addicted to welfare state and government employment. And to believe that Ursula von der Leyen is serious when she says that the Europeans will spend 5% of their budget on rearmament, it's a fantasy. It's never going to happen. That money, the European countries are all, not all, but most of the big ones are deeply, deeply indebted. They're carrying around huge debt burden and huge interest payments to service that debt, huge administrative and welfare costs. And The 5% military expenditure would have to come out of that, and the government which proposes it will automatically and swiftly lose the next general election. It's not going to happen. Europe is not going to become a superpower. There's no way it's even possible or conceivable. So Europe will remain an appendage of the United States. I want to get back to the three existing superpowers, which I think are probably the only ones that we'll have to deal with in the 21st century. Russia is the smallest of the three, but it has a key position, absolutely key position. Think about the Free Democrats in Germany in between the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats. The old days, now things have gone a little crazy in Germany, but in the whole post-war period, the FDP had this enormous influence, even though they never got more than between 6 and 10% of the vote. But they were the ones who made the government, because they would either join with the socialists or the Christian Democrats, and then that party would take over the government. Russia is a little bit in that position vis-a-vis China and the USA. Russia's the smallest, but if Russia joins one of the other big two, its weight is very, very important and can swing the balance. Now, okay, right now, Russia and China are joined at the hip. I don't think that's permanent. I don't think Russia wishes to be long-term dependent on the much larger and more dynamic Chinese economy. I think Russia will very quickly seek to have other options. That means other deals with the United States, so that it can have an intermediate position. It won't break off with China. It won't ally itself with the United States, but there will be a mix. And Russia and the United States have a lot in common. Their history and their attitudes are not too different, both big continental powers that formed themselves by conquest in the 18th, 19th centuries. And there's a lot of common thinking between Russians and the Americans, and there's a lot of common interests. We've talked a little bit about nuclear non-proliferation. I think very strongly, and you see this in Iran, the Russians don't want Iran to have a nuclear weapon. Chinese don't want it. US doesn't want it. The interests are in common. The Arctic region, huge future for the exploitation of the Arctic, and the best way for Russia to profit from that is in a deal with the United States. So I think you're going to see, once Ukraine is a blip in history, you're going to see a rapprochement, Russia and the United States. Russia and China, we've talked about it a little bit already. I mean, after 1949 and the victory of the communists, Mao Zedong in China, Russia moved in. It was the big brother then. It came in and very much helped the Chinese to form their new state apparatus. But right from the start, they were resented, and it didn't take too very long for the Chinese to quietly rebel against Russian influence, and that's what Nixon and Kissinger took advantage of to open up ties with China. I think now that China has the upper hand over Russia, Russia is not going to like it any more than China liked it when Russia had the upper hand over them. Finally, U.S.-China, it's maybe a little bit more complicated than some people think. If you look back at history, in 1944 and 1945, Franklin Delano Roosevelt President of the United States and architect of the post-war new order designed to enhance U.S. power and influence worldwide. Creation of the United Nations, Bretton Woods, all these organizations that are still around. He had a vision of U.S.-Russian cooperation. Roosevelt died in early 1945, before the end of the war, while Russia was the big ally of the United States in the war against Germany. He thought U.S.-Russian cooperation was very possible. But he also knew that with or without good relations with Russia, the U.S. would enhance its power by dominating Europe. So the big brother would be the United States, smaller brother would be Europe. And guess what? That turned out to suit the Europeans just fine. So ever since those days, Europe has delegated its security to the United States, complaining about it most of the time, to be sure, but did it nonetheless. Franklin Delano Roosevelt had the same kind of vision for the Pacific. Atlantic was U.S. dominating Europe. Pacific was U.S. and China. And the U.S. Went to a lot of trouble to chase the Japanese out of China, to liberate China from the Japanese yoke, pretty much all alone. They didn't have the Russians there to do most of the heavy lifting, as was the case in Europe. But the idea was, yeah, that was it. The Pacific was going to be an American lake with China as the junior partner on the other side. Now, Mao Zedong in 1949 changed that calculation rather radically. But I can tell you that this notion of US and China working together to dominate the Pacific never completely died. It never completely died. And if you'll permit me a personal anecdote, in my diplomatic career, I was among the first team of US diplomats who went into Beijing. This was Nixon ping-pong diplomacy, opening up a liaison office. We didn't recognize yet, but we had diplomatic relations. And the head of that liaison office was a man called David K.E. Bruce. And he was the most distinguished American diplomat of his time. I think it's fair to say. And he was already 80 years old when he was sent to China, sent to Beijing to represent the United States. And I think he was chosen because the government at the time thought, well, the Chinese respect older people, but they also respect somebody like David K.E. Bruce, who'd been in diplomacy in the 1920s, the 1930s, who knew Franklin Delano Roosevelt personally and had talked to him about China. And we didn't have much work to do in China. Henry Kissinger did it all in Washington. So we had plenty of chance to, drink wine and trade stories. And David K.E. Bruce liked to talk about how Franklin Delano Roosevelt envisioned the Pacific as an American lake with China as the link on the other side. And I think that influenced David Bruce's own thinking, because he was very friendly to the Chinese and very positive about the Chinese. I think he shared Roosevelt's vision. even though, you know, it was the great proletarian cultural revolution, and it couldn't be a worse time for China-U.S. relations. But he believed that there was a better way ahead. And here's the key thing, don't ever forget this. When Deng Xiaoping made his second revolution and introduced capitalism into the Chinese economy, which was the key change which brought about the great leap forward of China, lots of Americans, and I mean official Americans, people with authority over foreign policy, did everything they could to help China in that period. WTO membership, and a lot of other things too. The theory being that, you know, if you make China capitalist, before long they'll be democratic, and the Franklin Delano Roosevelt vision will be back, and the Pacific will become an American lake with the help of China.
Ambassador McKinley.
So, I finished. I finished.
History.
I have finished.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, experts, for sharing your vision on this very complex topic. Thank you very much, dear audience, for your attention, for your interest. Thank you, our team, Hicheme, Branson, Anita, Jamila, and Tanya, and our team members who couldn't be together with us, but who organized this event. And now we're happy to invite you to Apéro. This is a Swiss Mondevin brand Bessarabi, provided by winemaker Iwan Gerciu, who donated this wine for us, and I hope you will enjoy it. So we wish you a very pleasant evening. Please.